The morning after the storm passed, the mountain was still wet, the trees heavy with the weight of the rain. The air smelled fresh, clean, and cool. Eliza stood by the cabin's door looking out at the world that stretched before her. The storm had left the earth damp and the sky overcast, but the sun was starting to peek through the clouds, casting golden beams across the landscape. The wilderness felt different in the aftermath of the storm, peaceful, almost like it was holding its breath, waiting for something new to begin. Eliza's life had changed since she arrived in the mountains. It wasn't just the work, or the isolation, or even the quiet company of the mountain man. It was the way she had changed inside, the way the weight of fear and uncertainty had begun to lift from her shoulders. At first she had felt like a lost animal, unsure of where to go or what to do. But now, she was beginning to see the beauty of this place and the strength it had helped her uncover within herself. She stepped outside and walked toward the edge of the forest. The grass was still wet beneath her boots, and she could feel the earth soft and alive under her feet. The path she had taken so many times to gather firewood and supplies seemed different today. It no longer felt like a chore. It felt like part of something bigger. She was no longer just working to survive. She was building a life, and with each day, that life became a little more certain. The mountain man had been quiet the past few days, not offering much in the way of conversation, but always present. His silence had become a comfort to her, something she had learned to respect. He didn't need to say much, he spoke through his actions. And more than anything, Eliza had learned to listen to the silence, to appreciate the calm it brought. It was a kind of peace she had never known before. As Eliza walked through the trees, she thought about the time she had spent here. She had learned so much already. How to chop wood, how to fish, how to navigate the forest. The work had been hard, but it had also taught her something important, the value of her own strength. Back in the town, she had always felt like an outsider, too big, too loud, too different. But here in the mountains, her size and strength were assets. She was beginning to see herself in a new light, not as something to hide, but as something to be proud of. Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see the mountain man approaching, his figure tall and steady against the backdrop of the forest. He looked the same as always, rough, weathered, and distant, but there was something different about him today. There was a slight change in his posture, a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You're getting good at this," he said, his voice low but approving. Eliza smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She hadn't expected a compliment, but hearing it from him made all the hard work feel worth it. "I'm learning," she replied, her voice full of pride. The mountain man nodded, looking out at the landscape. "It's not easy out here. It never will be. But you're stronger than you think." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. His words meant more than she could express. She had spent so much of her life doubting herself, feeling like she was too much for the world around her. But now she was starting to believe that maybe she wasn't too much at all. Maybe, just maybe, she was exactly what the mountains needed. They stood together in silence for a while, the only sound the wind rustling through the trees. It was strange how comfortable the quiet had become. Eliza had always hated silence, always filled it with noise and words. But now she found peace in it. She was beginning to understand the value of stillness, of simply being present. After a while, the mountain man spoke again, his tone more serious this time. "You can stay here as long as you want. You've earned it." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She had never expected this kind of offer. She had come here with no other choice, no other place to go. But now the idea of staying in the mountains, of building a life here, felt like the right decision. "I want to stay," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think this is where I'm supposed to be." The mountain man nodded, his eyes meeting hers. There was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. "Then it's yours. But you'll have to keep working. There's always work to be done in these mountains." Eliza smiled, feeling a sense of determination rise within her. "I can handle it," she said firmly. "I've learned how to survive, and now I'll learn how to thrive." And thrive she would. The days that followed brought new challenges, new lessons, and new triumphs. Eliza worked with the mountain man, learning everything he had to teach her. She grew stronger, more capable, and more confident with each passing day. But what she learned most of all was the power of resilience, the power to keep going, even when the road seemed impossible, even when the storm seemed too fierce. With the mountain man's quiet guidance, Eliza started to build something that had always seemed out of reach, a sense of belonging. In the beginning, she had come to the mountains seeking escape, but now she realized that she had found a new life, one that she was building piece by piece. One afternoon, as they sat by the fire after a long day of work, the mountain man spoke again, his voice gentle but steady. "You're not just surviving anymore. You're living, and that's what matters." Eliza looked at him, her heart full. She had come here thinking that this would be the end of her journey, but now she saw it for what it truly was. The beginning. The beginning of something new, something that was entirely hers. And for the first time in her life, Eliza felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The mountains, with their wild beauty and harsh realities, had become her home. She had found her place in the world, not through survival or necessity, but through strength and choice. As the fire crackled between them, Eliza knew that the future was still uncertain. There would be more storms, more challenges, and more moments of doubt. But she was ready for them. She had learned the hard way that nothing in life comes easy, but everything could be earned. With the mountain man's quiet presence and her own growing confidence, Eliza knew she could face whatever came next. She was no longer the girl who had been sold for $1. She was a woman strong and capable with a future all her own, and as she looked out at the mountains, the horizon stretching out before her, Eliza knew that the rest of her life was just beginning. The days began to blend together as Eliza settled into the rhythm of life in the mountains. At first the work had been overwhelming, but now it had become something she could handle. She still felt the weight of her new life pressing down on her, but there was also a strange comfort in the routine. The mountain man, whom she still had not asked the name of, rarely spoke, but his actions spoke volumes. He was a man of few words, but when he did speak, there was something about his voice that made you listen. One morning, as Eliza finished gathering firewood from the forest, the mountain man spoke to her in his deep, gravelly voice. "The storm's coming," he said, looking at the sky where dark clouds were starting to roll in. "We'll need to make sure the cabin's ready." Eliza looked up at the sky and felt a pang of worry. The clouds looked heavy and threatening, the wind picking up, sending the trees swaying and creaking. She had never been caught in a mountain storm, but from the way the man spoke, she knew it was something that shouldn't be taken lightly. "Let's go get the roof patched up," he added, his tone practical and calm. Eliza followed him back to the cabin, her mind racing with thoughts of what a mountain storm might be like. Back home, storms were something they could prepare for, but here in the wilderness, everything felt more unpredictable. She watched the man move with ease as though he knew exactly how to handle the coming danger. The storm was closing in fast, the wind growing stronger with each passing minute. Eliza worked alongside him, lifting the heavy wooden beams that made up the cabin's roof and securing them with more nails and rope. She could feel the pressure of the moment. The storm would be here soon, and she didn't want to be unprepared. As they worked, Eliza couldn't help but notice how the man moved. Despite his large size, there was a quiet grace to him. He was efficient, never wasting a movement, and his hands worked with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. Eliza felt clumsy in comparison, her movements slower, more uncertain. But the man didn't seem to notice. He just continued to work, his focus entirely on getting the roof secure before the storm hit. The wind howled louder, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Eliza's heart raced as she hurried to help him, trying her best to keep up. The storm was coming fast, and she could feel the urgency in the air. She wasn't sure how much time they had, but it didn't matter. They had to finish, or they would be caught in the middle of it. By the time the rain began to pour in earnest, the roof was ready. The man looked at their work with a nod of approval, his face weathered but calm. "That'll hold," he said simply. Eliza felt a sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't sure if it was because the cabin was secure, or because she had helped to get it done. She hadn't realized just how much she had been relying on the man's experience. But in that moment, she realized something. She had learned from him without even realizing it. She had been so focused on surviving, on keeping up with the work, that she hadn't noticed how much the man's presence had taught her. As the storm raged outside, they settled inside the cabin. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Eliza sat near the warmth, her body sore from the day's work. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing she had been part of it. The storm lasted for hours, the wind howling and the rain beating against the cabin's walls. But inside, the mountain man made a simple meal of stew which they ate in silence. Eliza couldn't remember the last time she had shared a meal with someone, without the awkwardness or fear that usually came with such moments. Here, in the quiet of the cabin, there was something different. There was no need for small talk, no forced conversation. The silence between them was comfortable, even though they rarely spoke. After the meal, Eliza found herself sitting near the fire, staring into the flames. Her mind wandered back to the town, to the people she had left behind. She hadn't thought much about her family since she arrived here, but now, as she listened to the storm outside, memories of her parents and younger siblings flooded her thoughts. She wondered how they were doing, if they had made it through the winter. It wasn't that she missed them. Life in the town had been hard, and she had never felt truly at home there. But she did miss the familiarity, the feeling of knowing what came next. Here in the mountains, everything was new and unknown. There were no guarantees, no promises. But she also realized that maybe that was a good thing. The mountain man seemed to sense her quiet mood, though he didn't ask her about it. Instead, he sat down across from her, his face serious but not unkind. He had that same calm look about him, as though he had seen storms come and go 100 times. "You're doing well," he said quietly, his voice steady. Eliza looked up at him, surprised. She hadn't expected him to say anything like that. It wasn't much, just a simple acknowledgement, but it meant more to her than she could explain. "Thank you," she said softly. "I didn't know if I could do it, you know? It's all so different from what I'm used to." He nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "That's how it is. Nothing in life is easy. But you're strong. You've been strong since the start." Eliza felt something warm spread through her chest at his words. She hadn't realized how much she had been needing to hear that. She had spent so much of her life thinking that her size, her strength, were things that people didn't care about. But here in the mountains, it was different. Here her strength was an asset. It was something the mountain man respected. "I didn't know if I could survive out here," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But now I think I can." The mountain man's eyes softened for a moment, though he didn't smile. "You're learning, and that's all anyone can do. We don't have all the answers, but we do what we can." Eliza nodded, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt like maybe she had found a place where she belonged. It wasn't a perfect place, but it was a place where she could grow, where she could learn, and maybe even thrive. As the storm raged on outside, the warmth of the fire in the cabin felt like a shelter from the world. Eliza looked at the man across from her, a man who had shown her more kindness than she had expected, and wondered if perhaps this strange life in the mountains wasn't so bad after all. For the first time, Eliza felt a small glimmer of hope that she could build a future here, in the wilds of the mountain. Maybe, just maybe, she could make this place her own. The morning after Eliza arrived at the mountain man's cabin, she awoke early to the sound of birds singing outside. The sun had not yet fully risen, and the sky was still tinged with soft hues of pink and orange. She lay there for a moment, staring up at the ceiling, which was made of rough wooden beams, before the reality of her situation sank in once again. She was alone in a cabin in the wilderness, miles away from the life she had known. The town, the auction, the familiar faces, everything seemed so far away now. It was hard to believe she had been sold for so little, like an item at a market. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was no going back. This was her life now, and she had to find a way to survive. Eliza sat up on the bed and rubbed her eyes, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of unease. She had always been a hard worker, but this was different. She had no idea what kind of work the mountain man expected from her, or what kind of life she was supposed to lead in this place. She didn't even know his name. She had never been good with silence, and the stillness of the cabin pressed down on her like a weight. She needed to move, to do something. As she stood up and stretched, she heard a faint noise coming from outside, footsteps crunching on the gravel. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized the mountain man was already awake. She quickly brushed her hair back and straightened her dress, though she knew it didn't matter much. The man hadn't seemed concerned with her appearance so far, and she wasn't sure whether that was a good or bad thing. She stepped outside, squinting against the bright morning light. The fresh air was crisp, and the scent of pine trees and earth filled her lungs. The man was already standing near the edge of the cabin, his large frame silhouetted against the rising sun. He was staring out at the landscape, his back straight and his shoulders broad like a figure carved from stone. Without looking at her, he spoke. "You'll need to gather firewood. The winter's coming fast." Eliza nodded, though she wasn't sure where to start. She had helped her family gather firewood before, but it had always been in a forest close to home, not in the wilds of the mountains. She glanced around, trying to find the woodshed or a stack of logs, but all she saw was thick forest stretching for miles. The trees were tall and dense, their trunks covered in moss, their branches reaching high into the sky. It was both beautiful and intimidating. "Over there," the man said, nodding toward a patch of trees in the distance. "Start there. You'll need to chop down some small ones, and don't come back until you've got enough for the day." Eliza wasn't sure how much wood would be enough. She had no way of knowing what enough even meant in this strange place. But she didn't argue. She picked up the axe that the man had left near the door and made her way toward the trees. Her heart raced, partly from fear but mostly from the realization that she was on her own now. The woods were quiet, with only the sound of the wind whispering through the branches. Eliza found a small tree with a thin trunk and set to work, the axe biting into the wood with each swing. It wasn't long before the sweat began to bead on her forehead, and her muscles started to ache. She had never chopped down trees like this before, and the task was harder than she had imagined, but she was determined to prove that she could do it. She couldn't let the mountain man think she wasn't capable. With every swing, Eliza could feel the weight of her situation. She wasn't just working to survive. She was trying to earn a place in this new life, to show the man that she could be useful. The more she worked, the more she began to focus on the task at hand, the rhythm of the axe as it split through the wood, the feeling of the tree beginning to give way. Her breath became steady, and the pounding of her heart slowed as she lost herself in the work. Finally, after what felt like hours, the tree toppled to the ground with a crash. Eliza stood there for a moment, catching her breath, staring at the fallen tree. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. She had done it. She had chopped down her first tree on her own, in the middle of the mountains, far from home. Eliza took a moment to rest, wiping the sweat from her brow and leaning against the tree trunk. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the stillness of the woods seemed to press in on her. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time since arriving here, she felt a small sense of accomplishment. She began to chop up the fallen tree into manageable pieces of firewood, her hands becoming calloused and sore from the effort. She worked quickly, knowing that she had no time to waste. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, and soon it would be noon. As she worked, Eliza's mind wandered to the mountain man. He had said very little since they arrived at the cabin, and though she had tried to learn more about him, he didn't offer any details. He was a mystery, a man who seemed to exist only in the wilderness. She had never met anyone like him before. Despite his intimidating presence, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of respect for him. He had lived alone in these mountains for years, surviving on his own terms. Eliza had always been dependent on others, on her family, on the people in town. But here in this wilderness, everything seemed different. She would have to rely on herself, just like the mountain man. The thought of living like him, isolated from the world, was both frightening and freeing. Could she do it? Could she survive in a place like this, so far from everything she knew? The idea seemed impossible, but Eliza had never been one to back down from a challenge. If she had learned anything from her time in the town, it was that survival was a matter of grit. As the day wore on, Eliza continued to chop wood, the task becoming easier with each swing. By the time the sun began to dip lower in the sky, she had gathered enough firewood to fill the small pile by the cabin. Her muscles ached and her body was covered in dirt and sweat. But there was a small sense of pride in her work. She returned to the cabin just as the mountain man was preparing to start a fire. He glanced at the pile of firewood she had gathered and nodded approvingly. "Not bad," he said, his voice low. Eliza wasn't sure if he meant it as a compliment or just a neutral observation, but she took it as the former. She had done something right. For the first time since she had been brought to the cabin, Eliza felt like she might actually be able to make it here. The work was hard and the days were long, but there was something about the simplicity of life in the mountains that gave her a sense of purpose. The future was still uncertain, but for now, she had made it through her first day, and that was enough. As she sat down by the fire, The warmth from the flames wrapped around her, and she allowed herself a small smile. Maybe she was stronger than she had thought. The giant man's hand was rough like tree bark as it wrapped around Eliza's arm, pulling her along. She could feel the strength in his grip, a quiet power that seemed to hold the weight of the world. She had always been big, strong even, but the man before her made her feel small, as if she were nothing more than a leaf blown along in the wind. His presence was overwhelming, and the closer she got to him, the more she felt the weight of her situation. The crowd behind them started to murmur. Some people watched with curiosity, others with disapproval, but no one dared to speak up. The giant man, with his unkempt hair and tattered clothes, was not someone to be questioned. His sheer size and commanding presence made him an undeniable figure. The air around him seemed to hum with the power of someone who had lived on the edges of civilization, someone who had learned to survive without the rules of the townspeople. Eliza couldn't help but look up at him as they walked. His face was grizzled and weathered, covered by a thick beard that looked like it hadn't seen a razor in years. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they seemed to bore right through her, like he could see every thought in her mind. She wondered who this man was, where he came from, and why he had chosen her. The thought made her feel uneasy. The man didn't say a word as they walked through the town, his heavy footsteps echoing on the wooden planks of the street. People stepped aside to let him pass, keeping their distance from the imposing figure. Eliza felt the stares, the judgment from the townsfolk, and her face flushed with embarrassment. She had been sold like cattle, like something to be discarded, and now she was being led away by this giant of a man. As they walked, the sounds of the town slowly faded behind them, replaced by the quiet rustle of trees and the chirping of birds. Eliza's heart raced and her mind spun with thoughts of what was to come. She didn't know where the man was taking her, but it was clear that the town was behind her now, a place she had known all her life. She was stepping into the unknown. The man's grip on her arm loosened slightly as they moved further from the town. He didn't speak, and neither did Eliza. She wasn't sure what to say. What could she say? She was being taken by this stranger, and all she could do was follow. The road ahead of them was dusty and uneven, winding through the hills and forests that lay beyond the town. There was no sign of civilization in sight. After what felt like hours of walking, the man finally spoke, his voice deep and gravelly, as though it hadn't been used much in recent years. "You're not like the others," he said, his words surprising her. Eliza looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man glanced down at her, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "You're strong. You've been working hard all your life, haven't you?" he said. It wasn't a question, but a statement, as if he already knew the answer. Eliza nodded, unsure of what to say. "I've worked the fields. Helped my family," she said, her voice shaking. "But I'm not strong. Not like you." The man's lips twitched into something like a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Strength doesn't come from size alone," he said. "It's in here." He tapped his chest with one large finger. "And here." He pointed to his head. "You've got it, but you've never been shown how to use it." Eliza didn't understand what he meant. She had always worked hard, always given everything she had. What else was there to strength? Wasn't it all about muscle, about hard labor? But she didn't press him for an answer. She didn't want to anger him, and besides, he didn't seem like someone who was interested in explaining himself. They continued walking in silence, the crunch of their footsteps the only sound in the stillness of the wilderness. The man led her up a small hill, and when they reached the top, Eliza could see the landscape spread out before her. The mountains rose in the distance, towering and majestic, their snow-capped peaks hidden behind a veil of clouds. The trees seemed to stretch forever, a vast forest of dark green and brown untouched by human hands. The wilderness was both beautiful and terrifying, and for a moment Eliza felt small against the enormity of it all. "This is where I live," the man said suddenly, breaking the silence. He pointed to a small cabin nestled at the edge of the forest, barely visible behind the trees. It was simple, made of rough-hewn logs with smoke rising from a chimney. There was no sign of anyone else around, no other homes, no other people. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. She had been taken so far from the town, so far from everything she had ever known. The thought of being alone, isolated in this remote place with a man she barely knew, made her stomach twist with fear. "You'll work here," the man said, his voice steady and commanding. I'll teach you what you need to know. Work. The word rang in her ears. She had come here to escape a life of poverty. But was this really better? Was this freedom or just another form of servitude? They reached the cabin and the man gestured for Eliza to enter. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The interior of the cabin was simple, with a fireplace in the corner and a small table near the window. There was a bed in one corner, covered with a rough woolen blanket, and shelves filled with supplies, dried meats, jars of vegetables, and what looked like homegrown herbs. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and earth, a scent so different from the stifling air of the town. The man didn't follow her inside immediately. Instead, he stood in the doorway watching her carefully. Eliza felt his gaze on her, but she didn't know how to respond. She had never been in a place like this before, and the unfamiliarity of it made her feel uneasy. "This is your home now," the man said. "You'll stay here, work with me. There's plenty to do. You'll learn to survive in the mountains like I do. You'll help gather food, build shelter, and make sure we're ready for the winter." Eliza nodded, though her mind was still racing. She didn't know what kind of work he meant or how she could possibly survive in such a place. The mountain man's world was far different from anything she had ever known. But there was no turning back now. She had been sold, and this was her life. As she sat down on the bed, the man finally stepped inside. He didn't say anything more, just moved to the fireplace and began to stoke the fire, his large hands deftly arranging the logs. Eliza sat quietly watching him, her mind filled with questions. Who was this man? What did he want from her? And could she really survive in this strange new world he had pulled her into? The night stretched on, and Eliza couldn't help but wonder if she had made a terrible mistake by coming here. But the thought of returning to the town was even worse. What other choice did she have? For now, all she could do was wait and see what the future would bring. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of the small frontier town, casting long shadows over the buildings that stood like silent witnesses to the unforgiving life of the settlers. There was a tension in the air, something thick and heavy as if the land itself held its breath. The auction was about to begin, and everyone in town knew that it would be a day like no other. For Eliza, it felt like her heart was pounding so loud that everyone around her could hear it. She stood in the center of the dusty town square, surrounded by a crowd of men and women. Some of them were looking at her with pity, others with disinterest, but most of the men were eager, their eyes hungry with anticipation. The auctioneer, a thin man with a crooked nose, stood at a raised platform, his voice carrying through the hot air. "Step right up, folks. It's a fine day for an auction, and we've got some fine labor girls here ready to work for whoever bids the highest," he shouted, his voice cracking in the heat. The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others whispering amongst themselves. Eliza felt the eyes of the crowd on her, burning through her like 1,000 invisible needles. She stood tall, trying to keep her chin up, but she could feel her knees shaking. She wasn't like the other girls. She had always been bigger, taller, and stronger than most women. Some people called her fat, but she hated that word. It made her feel small, like she didn't belong. She tried to ignore the looks and whispers, but it was impossible. The town had always made her feel like she was too much of something. Too big, too loud, too noticeable. Her family had struggled for as long as she could remember. They had little money, and what little they did have often went to feed Eliza's younger siblings. She had been the oldest, the one who helped with chores and looked after the house. There was never much time for herself. But now the family was in worse shape than ever. Her father had fallen ill and the crops had failed again. Her mother was too tired from caring for the younger children to work much. That's when they had decided that Eliza needed to go. It wasn't a choice, really. It was more like an unspoken truth. She had to go, or they might not make it through the winter. So when the news came that the auction was happening, her heart sank. It was the only way for her to leave the house, the only way to find work and send money back home. She had no illusions about what her future held. This was the only chance for survival. As the auction began, Eliza's stomach twisted in knots. She had been sold once before, but not like this. The last time had been different. She had been young, still a child, and it had been at a different auction. Back then it had been more of a spectacle, a few pennies exchanged for a girl to work in the fields. But this time it felt so much more real. There was no escaping it now. One by one, the other girls were called up to the auction block. Some of them were younger than Eliza, small and delicate-looking while others were older and more experienced. But Eliza wasn't like any of them. Her body was strong, built from years of hard work and long days under the sun. She wasn't the kind of woman that would easily fit into someone's idea of beauty, and she knew it. Still, she hoped deep down that maybe, just maybe, someone would take pity on her. Someone would see that she was worth more than just a few coins. But as the bidding went on, Eliza began to realize that no one was interested in her. Her heart sank with each passing moment. The men called out their bids and the girls were sold one by one. But no one had even looked at Eliza. Then, just when Eliza thought she couldn't bear it any longer, she heard a voice from the back of the crowd. It was deep, gruff, and carried a sense of finality. It came from someone who seemed larger than life. Someone who belonged to the wild, untamed land beyond the town. The voice called out loud and unmistakable, "I'll take the fat one." The crowd fell silent. It wasn't a bidding war, not like the others. There was no hesitation in the voice. It was more of a command, a statement. Everyone turned to look, and Eliza's heart stopped in her chest. Standing in the back of the crowd was a man unlike any Eliza had ever seen. He was tall, no huge, with broad shoulders and thick arms that looked like they could lift a tree if he wanted to. His face was rough, weathered by years of living in the wilderness. His eyes were dark, but there was something about them, something cold and calculating. His long, untamed beard covered most of his face, but there was a certain presence about him that made it hard to look away. He pointed directly at Eliza, his finger cutting through the air like a blade. "I'll take her," he said again, his voice rumbling like thunder. It was so sudden, so unexpected that no one dared to speak. Even the auctioneer hesitated, glancing between the giant man and Eliza. The crowd seemed to part for him as he made his way forward, his boots thumping loudly on the wooden floor of the platform. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She had heard stories about the mountain men, the ones who lived far away from the town in the deep woods and rugged mountains. They were known for their strength, their isolation, and their fierce independence, but they were also feared. No one dared to cross them. The auctioneer cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Well, we have a bid here," he stammered. "The fat one, you say?" He looked back at Eliza, confusion written all over his face. He was used to bids for the younger, more delicate girls. But this was different. $1, is that your offer, sir?" The giant nodded without saying another word. It wasn't much, barely enough to buy a loaf of bread. But for Eliza, it might as well have been a mountain of gold. She had been sold. It was done. The crowd seemed to breathe a collective sigh, some murmuring, others shifting uncomfortably. Eliza stood there, rooted to the spot. She didn't know what to do. The giant man moved closer, his shadow falling over her. He was so much larger than anyone else, and yet despite his intimidating size, there was something about him that felt different. He didn't seem to care about the crowd's judgment, about the whispers or the uncomfortable stares. He simply came, took what he wanted, and left. Before she knew it, Eliza was standing next to him, her heart racing in her chest. He didn't say anything to her, just gestured for her to follow. She didn't have a choice. She had been sold for $1. As they walked away from the auction block, Eliza glanced over her shoulder, seeing the town behind her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She was about to embark on a journey she could never have imagined,